Ethan walked into his home at 3:17 p.m. on a Thursday. He knew the precise time because he had glanced at the minimalist watch on his wrist just as his key turned in the lock. The project he was overseeing, a complex urban renewal initiative, had hit a snag, a zoning variance denial that required a delicate touch. He had left the office early to begin the quiet, methodical work of untangling the political threads, a task best done from the serene quiet of his home study. The house was silent, which was expected. His wife, Clara, would be at one of her charity lunches, or a gallery opening, or a spin class. Her days were a carefully curated sequence of activities designed to fill the vast, empty spaces of her life. He moved through the cool, marble-floored foyer, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the stillness. He loosened his tie, a simple navy silk, and headed toward the master bedroom to change. He pushed the door open, and the first thing that hit him was the scent. It was a perfume, but not Clara's. Clara's scent was a light, almost ethereal blend of white florals and citrus, a fragrance called L'air du Temps that was as expensive as it was unremarkable. This was different. This was a heavy, cloying cloud of gardenia and musk, a scent that announced its presence with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. It was cheap, aggressive, and it clung to the air in their bedroom like a confession. For a moment, Ethan stood perfectly still in the doorway, his mind a perfect blank. Then the world sharpened into a painful, crystalline focus. He saw the slight indentation on the far side of the bed, the side Clara had never slept on. He saw a single long, blonde hair on his pillow. Clara was a brunette. He saw a champagne flute, smeared with garish pink lipstick, left carelessly on his nightstand, next to a framed photo of him and Clara on their wedding day. They had thought this house, this marriage, was a fortress built of stone. They didn't know it was built on sand, and the tide had just come in. Within 3 weeks, the entire structure of their lives, the grand facade that Clara and her family had so carefully constructed, would be nothing but a ruin. We've all had moments like this, haven't we? That sudden, gut-wrenching realization that the world, as you know, has irrevocably changed. It's a feeling that transcends borders and languages. I'd love to know where you're watching from today as we join Ethan on this journey. Drop a comment below and let me know. If you enjoy stories about the quiet strength that lies hidden within us and the eventual, satisfying triumph of integrity over arrogance, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss how this unfolds. The day had started like any other Thursday. The sun had streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their minimalist, architect-designed house. A house Ethan himself had designed, a fact Clara often omitted when giving tours to her friends. "We had it commissioned," she would say, a subtle distancing that placed Ethan in the category of hired help rather than a partner. He had woken at his usual 5:30 a.m., the architect's mind already churning with schematics and load-bearing calculations. He'd showered, dressed in his uniform of a simple white shirt and dark trousers, and gone downstairs to make coffee. Clara had drifted into the kitchen around 8, wrapped in a silk robe that cost more than the monthly salary of the junior associates at his firm. "You're still here," she'd said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of mild surprise, tinged with disapproval, as if his presence was an inconvenience, a disruption to her morning's planned serenity. "Good morning to you, too," Ethan had replied, his voice even and calm. He slid a mug of black coffee, prepared exactly as she liked it, across the vast marble island toward her. She ignored the coffee. "I need you to transfer some money to my account." She was scrolling through her phone, her thumb flicking impatiently over images of handbags and shoes. "The fall collection at Devereaux's just dropped, and I'm hosting the auxiliary luncheon next week. I need to look the part." "Of course," Ethan had said. He had already set up an automatic, generous monthly transfer for her personal expenses, an amount that would have been a staggering fortune to most people. But for Clara, it was never enough. Her needs expanded in direct proportion to the resources available, a fundamental law of their particular universe. "How much?" "Just make it 50, she'd said, waving a dismissive hand. 50,000. The cost of a decent car, or a down payment on a small house. For her, it was the price of a new wardrobe for a single season. She didn't look at him as she said it. Her gaze was fixed on the glowing screen in her hand, her expression one of intense concentration, as if she were a general planning a critical campaign. "I'll take care of it," Ethan had said. His calm was a shield, a fortress he had built around himself brick by brick over the years. Inside, he felt the familiar, weary ache. It wasn't about the money. He could have given her 10 times that amount and not noticed it on a balance sheet. It was about the utter lack of connection, the transactional nature of their interactions. He was not her husband. He was her provider, a well-oiled, efficient, and largely invisible ATM. "And Richard called," she added, her tone shifting, becoming brighter. "He wants us over for dinner on Saturday. He's finally landed the Blackwood development deal. It's going to be huge. Julian helped him broker the financing. You know Julian, of course." Brilliant. Ethan knew Julian. Julian Vance, a distant cousin of Clara's, a man who wore his family's old money like a suit of armor and possessed a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He worked in finance, a vague and impressive-sounding career that involved moving other people's money around and taking a sizable cut. Richard, Clara's father, adored him. He saw in Julian the son he'd never had, ruthless, ambitious, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. "That's wonderful for your father," Ethan said, his voice a flat, neutral surface. He picked up his leather portfolio from the counter. It was a simple, unadorned thing, its surface worn smooth with years of use. Inside it were the schematics for a new public art center, but also, nestled in a hidden compartment, were the incorporation documents for a company called Ethelred Holdings. No one in this house, no one in Clara's family, knew that name. To them, Ethan Vance was just a moderately successful architect who worked for a respectable, if unimpressive, firm. They had no idea that he owned the firm, and the firm above that, and the holding company that owned it all. The portfolio was his symbolic object, a quiet reminder of a reality they refused to see. "Try to be enthusiastic on Saturday," Clara had said, finally looking up from her phone. Her eyes, the color of cool jade, swept over him, taking in his simple clothes, his quiet demeanor. It was a look he knew well. It was a look of assessment, and it always found him wanting. "Richard is on top of the world. Don't bring the mood down by talking about, your little projects." His little projects, the Public Arts Center, a low-income housing initiative, a state-of-the-art pediatric hospital wing he was designing pro bono. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "I'll be on my best behavior." She had smiled then, a brief, satisfied little smile. "Good." She picked up the mug of coffee he had poured, took a delicate sip, and then set it down. "This is cold." Then she had turned and drifted out of the room, leaving him alone in the vast, silent kitchen. The echo of her dismissal hung in the air long after she was gone. Now, standing in the doorway of their bedroom, inhaling the ghost of another person, Ethan realized that the coldness wasn't in the coffee. It was in the very foundation of their home. And he, the master architect, was finally ready to assess the damage and begin the demolition. He took a slow, deep breath, the foreign perfume a toxic invader in his lungs, and his mind began to work, not with the hurt of a betrayed husband, but with the cold, detached precision of a man planning a controlled demolition. The Saturday of Richard's celebratory dinner arrived draped in a heavy, oppressive humidity. The air itself felt thick with unspoken tensions. Ethan drove them to his father-in-law's palatial estate in his own car, a meticulously maintained but decidedly understated sedan. Clara had wanted to take her new convertible, the one she'd insisted was an absolute necessity for her charity work, but Ethan had been firm in his quiet way. "I'll drive tonight," he'd said, and the finality in his tone had been enough to quell her protests, though it earned him a look of simmering resentment that lasted the entire 40-minute drive. Richard's house was a monument to new money's desperate attempt to look like old money. It was a sprawling, faux Tuscan villa plopped incongruously in the middle of a manicured Ohio suburb, complete with soaring columns, an ostentatious fountain, and acres of unnaturally green lawn. As Ethan pulled up the sweeping driveway, parking his modest car between a fire-engine red Ferrari and a gleaming black Bentley, he could feel Clara physically cringe beside him. "Must we always arrive in this thing?" she muttered, gesturing at the car as if it were a cockroach. "It's embarrassing. Julian is here. His car probably cost more than our house." Ethan knew for a fact that this was untrue. He had designed and built their house, and he knew its market value to the penny. He also knew, through the discreet channels of Ethelred Holdings, the exact state of Julian Vance's finances, which were a far more precarious and debt-leveraged affair than his flashy car suggested. But he said nothing. He simply killed the engine and looked at his wife. "The house is paid for, Clara. The car is paid for. There is a certain peace in that." "Oh, spare me the noble poverty act, Ethan," she snapped, her voice a low hiss. "This isn't about peace, it's about ambition. Or your lack of it." She got out of the car, slamming the door with a force that made the vehicle shudder. Ethan took a moment before following. He rested his hands on the steering wheel, his gaze falling on the simple leather portfolio resting on the passenger seat. He had brought it with him, as he always did. It was his anchor in these turbulent waters. He ran a thumb over the worn leather, feeling the solid presence of the documents within. It was a silent conversation with himself, a reaffirmation of the truth he held while they all played their elaborate fictions. Then, with a slow exhale, he got out of the car and walked toward the grand, double-doored entrance from which laughter and the clinking of glasses already spilled. The scene inside was exactly as he'd anticipated. Richard Thorne, a man whose physical stature seemed to swell in direct proportion to his net worth, stood in the center of his cavernous living room, a glass of what was undoubtedly ruinously expensive scotch in his hand. He was holding court, his booming voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Clara's mother, Eleanor, a woman who had faded into a pale, anxious echo of her husband, hovered at his side, her smile plastered on like a mask. And there, leaning against the mantelpiece with an air of casual ownership, was Julian. He was tall, blond, and handsome in the predatory way of a shark, his teeth a little too white, his smile a little too wide. Richard's eyes landed on Ethan as he entered, and a look of barely concealed disdain flickered across his face. "Ethan, there you are. We were just celebrating a real victory here. The Blackwood Tower, 70 stories of glass and steel, a new icon for the city skyline." He clapped a heavy hand on Julian's shoulder. "And this is the man who made it happen. Julian, my boy. He structured a deal so brilliant. The banks were practically begging to give us their money." Julian gave a modest, self-deprecating shrug that was anything but. "I just connect the dots, Richard. You're the one with the vision." His eyes slid over to Ethan, a glint of smug amusement in them. "Ethan, good to see you. Still drawing your little blueprints." The insult was delivered with a silken smile, designed to sound like a friendly jest to the casual listener, but Ethan felt its barb as intended. It was a continuation of a long-running theme, the dismissal of his profession as a quaint, inconsequential hobby. Clara, who had already glided over to join them, laughed a little too loudly. "Oh, be nice, Julian. Ethan works very hard on his buildings." The pause was infinitesimal, but it was there. It was the same tone she used when referring to a child's macaroni art. "Indeed," Richard boomed, his focus already drifting away from Ethan, whom he considered a conversational dead end. "The architects on this project are the best in the world. A firm out of Zurich, apparently. Very exclusive, very expensive. They only work with visionaries," he winked, taking another large gulp of his scotch. Ethan felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He was an observer, a scientist studying a foreign species in its native habitat. He knew the Zurich firm Richard was talking about. He had acquired it 3 years ago through a subsidiary of Ethelred Holdings. The lead designer, a man Richard probably imagined as a pipe-smoking European genius named Jean-Pierre, was a brilliant young woman from Iowa named Brenda, who reported directly to Ethan every Tuesday via a secure video call. The irony was so thick he could have cut it with a dinner knife. "That sounds impressive," Ethan said, his voice quiet but clear. The simplicity of his statement made them all turn to look at him, as if surprised he could speak. Impressive. Richard laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Son, this deal is going to triple my net worth. It's the kind of thing you build a legacy on. You wouldn't understand. It's a world away from designing someone's kitchen remodel. He was baiting him. They were all baiting him. It was a sport for them, a way to reinforce their own sense of superiority by highlighting his perceived inferiority. In the past, these moments would have filled him with a hot, impotent anger. But not anymore. Not since the cloying scent of gardenia and musk had reordered his universe. Now he felt only a cold, clarifying focus. He was watching a chess match where his opponents were celebrating their capture of a pawn, oblivious to the fact that his queen was positioned for a checkmate they couldn't even conceive of. He met his father-in-law's gaze. "You're right, Richard," he said softly, and the quiet sincerity in his tone momentarily disarmed the man. "I wouldn't understand." He let the words hang in the air, allowing them to interpret it as the admission of defeat they so desperately wanted it to be. He saw the flicker of triumph in Clara's eyes, the condescending smirk on Julian's face, the satisfied grunt from Richard. They had won this round. They always won. He took a sip of the water a server offered him, the cool liquid a welcome balm. He could be patient. The architect in him knew that the most enduring structures are built on a foundation of patience. And the foundation he was now laying was for a reckoning. The days following the disastrous dinner party at Richard's estate settled into a new, tense rhythm. The air in the house grew thick with things unsaid, a silence that was heavier and more suffocating than any argument. Clara treated Ethan with a kind of brittle, high-strung courtesy that was more insulting than her usual dismissiveness. She was playing the part of the dutiful wife, but her performance was thin, her smile strained, her touch fleeting and cold. She was a ghost in their home, haunting the rooms with her discontent. One afternoon, a week after the dinner, Ethan was working in his study when Clara appeared in the doorway. She was dressed for an outing, wearing a white linen dress that highlighted her tan and a pair of sunglasses perched on her head like a tiara. She was holding her tablet, her expression a careful mixture of businesslike efficiency and marital expectation. "I need to talk to you about something," she began, not waiting for an invitation to enter. She sat in the leather armchair opposite his desk, the one usually reserved for clients, crossing her legs with a rustle of expensive fabric. The gesture immediately established the dynamic. This was a business meeting, not a conversation between partners. "I'm listening," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair. He didn't stop his work. His pen continued to move across a large sheet of vellum, sketching the graceful, sweeping lines of a cantilevered roof. The steady motion was calming, a physical manifestation of his focus. "It's about the fundraiser for the Children's Hospital," she said, tapping the screen of her tablet. "I'm on the planning committee, as you know. We're finalizing the gala, and the auction items are a little lackluster this year. Victoria Croft's husband just donated a week on their yacht in the Amalfi Coast, and the Bradleys are offering a private jet to Aspen for a ski weekend." She looked up at him, her jade eyes narrowed. "We need to make a significant contribution, Ethan. Something that shows we're serious players." Ethan paused his drawing. He placed the pen down with deliberate care, creating a small, precise click that seemed to echo in the quiet room. "We already made our annual donation to the hospital, Clara. A very generous one. If I recall," he knew the exact figure, as he had signed the check himself. "It was a sum that could have funded a small clinic in a developing country for a year." Clara waved a dismissive hand, a gesture that was becoming her signature. "Donations are invisible. This is about status. It's about perception. My father is a major benefactor. Julian's family has a whole wing named after them. What do we have? The Vance and Thor name needs to be associated with a major, headline-grabbing item. And what did you have in mind?" Ethan asked, his voice dangerously soft. "I was thinking," she said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone, as if they were partners in a grand scheme, "that you could offer a custom home design. A pro bono project. A dream house by Ethan Vance, We could build a whole narrative around it. The sought-after, elusive architect granting a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Her eyes shone with the brilliance of her own idea. She truly believed she was being clever, that she was packaging him and his talent in a way that would benefit them both. The audacity of it almost made him laugh. She wanted to auction him off like a prize stud, to put his life's work, his passion, his very identity on the block to be sold to the highest bidder in her desperate climb up the social ladder. She saw no difference between his architectural genius and a week on a yacht. They were both commodities, assets to be leveraged for status. "No," Ethan said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the space between them with the force of a physical blow. Clara's carefully constructed composure cracked. "No? What do you mean, no?" "Ethan, you don't understand. This is important. This is for our reputation. My work is not an auction item. Clara," he said, his gaze steady. "It's not something to be dangled in front of your friends to make you feel important. It has value beyond what someone is willing to pay for it at a charity gala." Her face hardened, the mask of the charming socialite melting away to reveal the raw, petulant anger beneath. "Value? You talk about value? Your problem, Ethan, is that you have no concept of real value. You're content in your little world, with your little drawings and your little firm. You have no ambition. Julian was just telling me the other day. He closed a deal worth more than your firm probably makes in a decade. That's value. That's power." The mention of Julian's name was the final turn of the screw. It was a deliberate, calculated cruelty meant to wound him, to remind him of his own perceived inadequacy in her eyes. And it worked, but not in the way she intended. It didn't wound his pride. It solidified his resolve. It was the final piece of data he needed, the confirmation that this was not a marriage in trouble, but a hostile takeover that had been in progress for years. He stood up, walking over to the large window that overlooked the meticulously landscaped garden. He looked out at the Japanese maple tree he had planted himself, its leaves a fiery red against the deep green of the lawn. It was a symbol of patience, of slow, steady growth. "I see," he said, his back still to her. "Thank you for clarifying your position." "My position?" she scoffed, rising from the chair. "This isn't about my position, Ethan. It's about your failure. Your failure to be the man I, and my family, expected you to be." She stormed out of the study, her angry footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Ethan remained at the window for a long time, watching the leaves of the maple tree tremble in the breeze. He felt a profound sense of clarity, a quiet that was the opposite of the house's oppressive silence. It was the calm of a man who has finally accepted a difficult truth and knows exactly what he must do. He returned to his desk, but he didn't pick up the pen to continue his sketch. Instead, he picked up his phone. He scrolled through his contacts past Clara, past Richard, past all the names that belonged to his old life. He stopped at a single entry. "Sarah." He pressed the call button. She answered on the first ring. "Mr. Vance." Her voice was crisp, efficient, and loyal. Sarah Chun was his second in command, the COO of his entire enterprise, and one of only 3 people in the world who knew the full extent of his holdings. "Sarah," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. "It's time. Please begin the Blackwood Protocol, and I need you to compile a complete asset and liability report on Julian Vance. Everything. I want to know about every dollar he has, and more importantly, every dollar he owes." There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line, not of hesitation, but of understanding. "Consider it done, sir," she said. "The preliminary portfolio will be on your secure server within the hour." Ethan hung up the phone. He looked down at his desk, at the half-finished drawing of the cantilevered roof. It was a beautiful design, elegant and strong, seemingly defying gravity. But he knew its secret. He knew about the hidden steel beams, the deep-set foundation, the complex internal structure that gave it its strength. People only saw the graceful lines, the effortless beauty. They never saw the work, the planning, the hidden power that held it all up. They were about to. The invitation arrived a week later, nestled amongst the bills and glossy catalogs in the mailbox. It was thick, cream-colored cardstock, the kind that feels important even before you read it. The lettering was embossed in gold foil. Richard Thorne cordially invites you to a celebration of the Blackwood Tower project. The event was to be held at the most exclusive private club in the city, a place with a century-old waiting list and a reputation for turning away billionaires who were deemed too new. Richard, of course, had leveraged his way into a membership years ago. Clara was ecstatic. She held the invitation as if it were a holy relic. "This is it, Ethan," she breathed, her eyes shining with a feverish light. "This is the night everything changes. This solidifies Daddy's legacy. And our place. You have to admit, it's thrilling." "It is," Ethan said, his voice a low murmur. He was looking at the invitation over her shoulder. His eyes weren't on the gold lettering, but on the small, discreetly printed list of primary project partners at the bottom. Tucked between Thorne Development and Sterling Capital Bank was the name of the architectural firm. Atelier Gestalt, Zurich, his firm. His people, his design. The quiet irony was a constant companion these days. The week leading up to the party was a whirlwind of preparations for Clara. She had appointments for her hair, her nails, a facial. A couturier was flown in from New York to fit her for a custom gown. The house was filled with the frantic energy of her ambition. Ethan, by contrast, moved through the chaos with an almost preternatural calm. He went to his office each day, but his work had changed. He was no longer just an architect of buildings. He was now the architect of a grand and terrible revelation. In the evenings, after Clara was asleep, a state she achieved with the help of a silk-eye mask and a single, precisely measured glass of Chardonnay, Ethan would retreat to his study. The room had become his sanctuary, his war room. On his secure computer, he would review the files Sarah sent him. They were dense, intricate documents, detailing the complex web of finance and liability that underpinned Richard's Blackwood Tower project. He studied them with the same intensity he would a structural engineering report, identifying stress points, load-bearing columns, and, most importantly, the fatal flaws. The flaw, as he had suspected, was Julian Vance. Julian had built a house of cards, a dazzling structure of leveraged debt, inflated projections, and backroom handshakes. He had convinced Sterling Capital Bank to provide the primary loan based on a commitment from a secondary investment group, Orion International. But Orion International, as Ethan now knew from Sarah's meticulous research, was a shell corporation with a history of defaulting, a fact Julian had conveniently obscured with a series of complex financial maneuvers. The entire 70-story tower was balanced on a foundation of lies. And the man who held the real power, the man who could either shore up that foundation or kick it out from under them, was Ethan himself. Ethelred Holdings, his quiet, unassuming parent company, had purchased Sterling Capital Bank 6 months prior. They were his bankers, and they didn't even know it. The night of the party, a cool, clear evening in early autumn, felt charged with electricity. Ethan stood in their bedroom, already dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, watching Clara put the finishing touches on her appearance. She was a vision in emerald green, the dress clinging to her form, a cascade of diamonds at her throat. She looked magnificent, a queen ready for her coronation. But as she turned from the mirror, her eyes fell on him, and the familiar look of critical assessment returned. "Is that what you're wearing?" she asked, a slight frown marring her perfect makeup. "It's so plain. So you." "It's a suit, Clara," he said, adjusting his tie. "But it's not a statement," she countered. "Look at you. You look like you're going to a meeting. This is a celebration. You should look powerful." "Power isn't always loud, Clara," he said softly. He walked over to his dresser and picked up a small, unassuming object, a simple, silver tie clip in the shape of a T-square, a gift from his mentor years ago. It was the only piece of jewelry he ever wore. He clipped it to his tie, the metallic click a small, definitive sound in the quiet room. Sometimes, the most powerful things are the ones you don't see. She sighed, a theatrical exhalation of frustration. "I don't have time to debate philosophy with you, Ethan. Just try to look happy for my father. This is his night." "Oh, I will," Ethan said, and for the first time that evening, a genuine, though enigmatic smile touched his lips. I have a feeling this will be a night none of us will ever forget. As they walked out to the car, Ethan carrying his leather portfolio as always, Clara paused. "You're not bringing that thing, are you?" she asked, her voice laced with exasperation. "I am," he said, his hand resting on the worn leather. "I have some papers Richard might be interested in seeing." She rolled her eyes. "Don't you dare try to talk business with him tonight, Ethan. Not your business, anyway. It will just be embarrassing for everyone." He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the garage. "I promise you, Clara," he said, his voice a low, resonant promise. "I will not embarrass you. Not in the way you think." He opened the car door for her, a perfect gentleman. The quiet before the storm was over. The first drops of rain were beginning to fall. The City Club was an imposing edifice of granite and dark wood, a place that smelled of old leather, cigar smoke, and a century of accumulated power. Stepping inside was like stepping into a different era, a world where fortunes were made and broken over a glass of brandy and a quiet word. Tonight, the club was alive with the buzz of Richard Thorne's triumph. The main ballroom, a cavernous space with a ceiling painted to look like the heavens, was filled with the city's elite. Men in bespoke suits and women dripping with jewels moved through the room, their laughter echoing like the chimes of a crystal chandelier. Ethan and Clara made their entrance. Clara was immediately subsumed into the glittering crowd, swept away by a wave of air kisses and murmured compliments on her dress. She moved through the room with the practiced grace of a born socialite, her smile bright and confident. She was in her element. Ethan, by contrast, became an island of stillness in the swirling current. He was polite, he nodded, he accepted a glass of champagne from passing waiter, but he remained slightly apart, an observer. He saw Julian holding court by the bar, his voice loud, his gestures expansive. He saw Richard, his face flushed with victory and expensive wine, accepting congratulations like a king receiving tribute. He felt a hand on his arm and turned to see Eleanor, Clara's mother. Her face was a mask of strained pleasantry, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Ethan, dear, you're looking well," she said, her voice thin. "Isn't this a wonderful night?" "Richard is just over the moon. He seems very pleased," Ethan agreed. "Yes, well, the Blackwood Project, it's his masterpiece. His legacy." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know, he was so worried for a while. The financing was tricky, but then Julian, bless him, he worked a miracle. Richard says he's a genius. A real shark." She said the word shark as a compliment, the highest praise in their world. "Miracles are often a matter of perspective, Eleanor," Ethan said quietly. "Sometimes they're just illusions that haven't been exposed to the light yet." Eleanor looked at him, a flicker of confusion in her anxious eyes. She didn't understand what he meant, but the intensity in his gaze made her uncomfortable. She gave a little, nervous laugh. "Well, I'm sure I don't know anything about that. I should go mingle. Enjoy yourself, Ethan." She patted his arm again and then scurried away, drawn back into the orbit of her husband's gravitational pull. Ethan watched her go. She was the silent enabler, the one who saw the cruelty and the arrogance but chose to look away, to smooth things over, to keep the peace at any cost. Her complicity, he realized, was a different kind of poison, slower acting, but just as deadly. He spent the next hour in this state of detached observation. He listened as people praised the architectural design of the Blackwood Tower, using words like bold, visionary, and breathtaking. They spoke of the mysterious Zurich firm, Atelier Gestalt, with a kind of hushed reverence, as if it were a mythical entity. No one in the room, not the bankers, not the developers, not even the man whose name was on the invitation, had any idea that the chief architect of that myth was standing right there among them, nursing a glass of sparkling water. Finally, the moment arrived. Richard mounted the small stage at the front of the room, tapping a spoon against his champagne flute to call for attention. The buzz of conversation slowly died down. A hush fell over the ballroom. Richard beamed, his face ruddy in the warm glow of the chandeliers. "Friends, colleagues, Thank you all for coming, he boomed, his voice filling the room. Tonight is a special night. Tonight, we celebrate not just a building, but a dream, a vision. The Blackwood Tower. A round of enthusiastic applause broke out. Richard let it wash over him, basking in the adoration. This project, he continued, is the culmination of a lifetime of work. It's a testament to what is possible when you have a great team, a great vision, and an unwavering belief in yourself. He paused for effect. I want to thank the brilliant minds at Sterling Capital for seeing that vision. And I especially want to thank the man who brought it all together, the financial wizard who made the impossible possible. My future son-in-law in all but name, Julian Vance. Another, even louder round of applause. Julian, standing near the stage, gave a gracious bow, a picture of smug humility. Ethan watched Clara's face. She was looking at Julian with an expression of pure adoration, her eyes shining. In that moment, she was not Ethan's wife. She belonged to the dream Richard was selling from the stage, a dream of power and status in which Ethan had no part. And finally, Richard said, raising his glass, to the architects, the geniuses at Atelier Gestalt in Zurich. I don't know who they are, but they're worth every penny. The crowd laughed. They've designed a building that will define our city for the next century. A true masterpiece. Richard was at the absolute zenith of his arrogance, the peak of his triumph. The entire room was captivated by his success. The timing was perfect. Ethan began to move. He set his untouched glass of water down on a nearby table. He picked up his leather portfolio. He started walking toward the stage, his steps unhurried, deliberate. A few people turned to look at him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and confusion. What was the quiet, unassuming architect husband doing? He didn't stop at the steps of the stage. He walked right up them, moving to stand beside his stunned father-in-law. The room fell into a sudden, deep silence. Richard turned to him, his face a mask of disbelief and burgeoning anger. Ethan, what in God's name do you think you're doing? Get off the stage. Ethan ignored him. He turned to face the crowd, his expression calm, his gaze sweeping across the sea of confused faces. He found Clara in the crowd, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fury. He met her gaze for a brief, significant moment. Then he turned his attention back to the room. He walked to the microphone, which Richard had left standing in the center of the stage. He adjusted it slightly, the small movement seeming loud in the absolute stillness. He leaned in, his voice, when it came, not loud or angry, but quiet, clear, and carrying to every corner of the ballroom. Good evening, Ethan began. My father-in-law is a man of great enthusiasm, but in his excitement, I believe he's made a few small omissions. I'd like to take a moment to clarify some of the details of the Blackwood Tower project. The confrontation had begun. The first quiet bomb was about to drop. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. All eyes were on Ethan, a man most of them had barely registered all night. Richard took a step toward him, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. Ethan, I am warning you. Get off this stage right now. His voice was a low, furious growl, meant for Ethan alone, but in the dead silence of the room, everyone heard it. Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Richard. He kept his gaze fixed on the audience, his posture relaxed, his voice maintaining its unervingly calm tone. Richard mentioned the architects. He continued, as if his father-in-law hadn't spoken. Atelier Gestalt of Zurich. He called them geniuses. He praised their vision, their boldness. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. And on that point, he and I are in complete agreement. It is a brilliant design. He turned his head slightly, a small, deliberate movement, and looked directly at Richard. But you see, Richard, you're wrong about one thing. You said you didn't know who they are. Ethan's voice dropped even lower, becoming more intimate, yet it seemed to amplify in the charged atmosphere. But you do know who they are. You've known me for 10 years. The statement landed. Simple, devastating, final. For a fraction of a second, there was only confusion. The crowd tried to process the information, to connect the dots. The quiet architect husband, the mythical Zurich firm, it didn't compute. It was like trying to solve an equation where 2 plus 2 equaled a skyscraper. Then, a nervous laugh broke the silence. It was Julian. He stepped forward from the side of the stage, his handsome face contorted in a sneer of disbelief. "Is this a joke?" he called out, playing to the crowd. "Ethan, what are you talking about? Did you have one too many glasses of water? You designed patios, not 70-story towers." The crowd tittered, relieved. Of course, it was a joke. A clumsy, embarrassing, and deeply inappropriate joke. They looked at Ethan, expecting him to shrink, to stammer an apology, to scurry off the stage in shame. He did not. Instead, Ethan opened the simple leather portfolio he had carried with him all night. The room watched, mesmerized, as he extracted a single, large, rolled-up document. He walked over to a table at the edge of the stage, the one reserved for Richard's celebratory cake, and unfurled it. It was a detailed architectural schematic, a cross-section of the Blackwood Tower, rendered in exquisite, hand-drawn detail. His signature was clearly visible in the bottom right-hand corner. E. Vance. "My legal name is Ethan Vance," he said, his voice resonating through the microphone. "The E. Vance who signed these blueprints. The founder and sole proprietor of the architectural firm you know as Atelier Gestalt. I established the Zurich office 5 years ago as a European headquarters, but the parent company, the one I own, has always been based right here." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. This was no longer a joke. This was something else entirely. The expressions on the faces in the crowd shifted from confusion to shock, from amusement to rapt attention. They were witnessing a power play of a magnitude they had never seen before. Richard stared at the blueprint, then at Ethan, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The blustering, confident titan of industry had vanished, replaced by a confused, sputtering old man. That's impossible," he stammered. You're a nobody. You work for a small firm." "I own that firm, too," Ethan replied calmly. "And it's the construction company that was awarded the primary building contract, and the material supplier for the specialized glass curtain wall." He began to tick them off, his voice a steady, methodical rhythm, the voice of an auditor reading a list of assets. "All of them are subsidiaries of my holding company, Ethelred Holdings." He let the name hang in the air. It meant nothing to most people in the room, but he saw a flicker of recognition, of dawning horror, in the eyes of the senior partners from Sterling Capital Bank who were clustered near the front. They were beginning to understand. Clara stood frozen in the middle of the room, her face a pale, bloodless mask. The emerald of her dress seemed garish against her ashen skin. Her eyes were locked on Ethan, but it was as if she was seeing a stranger, a man she had never met. The quiet, unambitious husband she had so casually dismissed was standing on a stage, calmly dismantling her entire world with a few quiet sentences. Julian, however, was not so easily cowed. Arrogance was his default setting. "This is insane," he shouted, moving toward the stage. "He's lying. This is some kind of pathetic fantasy. Richard, are you going to let him stand up here and spout these delusions?" Ethan turned his gaze to Julian. It was the first time he had truly looked at him all night. His expression was not one of anger, but of something far more chilling, pity. "Julian Vance," he said, his voice taking on a new, sharper edge. "A financial wizard, Richard called you. A man who worked a miracle with the financing." He reached back into his portfolio and pulled out a second folder, this one slim and black. The miracle, as I understand it, was securing a secondary investment from a group called Orion International to guarantee the primary loan from Sterling Capital. He opened the folder. "It's a shame you didn't do your due diligence, Julian. Orion International has been a shell for a vulture fund for the last 18 months. They have a 90% default rate. Their guarantee wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. The deal you built was a house of cards." Julian's face went white. "That's not true. The financials were solid. They were a lie," Ethan stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "And Sterling Capital was about to find that out. The whole project would have collapsed within 6 months, leaving Richard holding billions in debt and a half-finished hole in the ground." It would have ruined him. It would have ruined you all. He looked out at the bankers, who were now sweating profusely. But Ethan continued, a slight, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. Something interesting happened. My company, Ethelred Holdings, acquired Sterling Capital Bank 6 months ago. Which means, Richard, he turned to face his father-in-law, whose legs seemed to have given out, forcing him to clutch the lectern for support. The bank you have been lying to, the bank whose money you are using to build your legacy, is my bank. The 70-story tower you are so proud of. I own it, and I own you. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure, sucking the very air from the room. The full, devastating scope of the revelation settled upon them. Ethan Vance, the quiet man, the failed husband, the little architect, was not a pawn in their game. He was the board, the players, and the hand that moved the pieces. He held all the power. He always had. He then turned his gaze back to Clara. He didn't need to say a word. His eyes said it all. He saw her for what she was, a beautiful, hollow vessel, chasing the reflection of power without ever understanding its source. The reversal was complete. The humiliated now held the power of judgment, and the arrogant were left with nothing but the ruins of their own hubris. Clara was the first to break. A choked, desperate sound escaped her throat. She took a stumbling step forward, her hand outstretched as if to ward off his words, to physically push back the reality that was crashing down upon her. Ethan, no, I don't understand. You never did, Clara, Ethan said, his voice no longer for the room, but just for her. It was not cruel, but it was laden with the weight of a decade of quiet disappointments. That was the entire problem. Richard, his face the color of ash, finally found his voice. It was a weak, reedy thing, a pathetic echo of his earlier bombast. Why? He croaked, leaning heavily on the lectern. Why would you do this? Why let it go this far? Ethan looked at the man who had belittled and mocked him for years. He could have listed 1,000 cuts, a decade of humiliations. The laughter at his car, the dismissal of his life's work, the constant grinding disrespect. Instead, he chose a simpler, more profound truth. He gestured to the crowd, to the opulent room, to the tower blueprints that represented a dream Richard had tried to steal. You built your world on a foundation of arrogance and appearances, Ethan said, his voice once again clear and resonant. You judge men by the car they drive, not the content of their character. You valued status over substance, and you taught your daughter to do the same. He looked at Clara again, her face streaked with tears that ruined her perfect makeup. You thought my work was a little project. You thought my ambition was a flaw. You never once bothered to look beneath the surface to see the man I actually am. You only saw the man you wanted me to be, someone small, so you could feel big. This was the moral mirror, the moment he reflected their own behavior back at them, stripped of all its self-serving justifications. There was no argument, no defense against the simple, unvarnished truth. At that moment, a figure appeared at the ballroom entrance. It was Sarah Chun, Ethan's COO. She was dressed in a sharp, practical business suit, and she carried a sleek, modern briefcase. She walked through the stunned, silent crowd with a sense of purpose, her heels clicking decisively on the polished marble floor. She didn't seem to notice the drama. She was simply an executive arriving to a meeting. She walked directly to the stage, up the steps, and handed Ethan the briefcase. The dissolution papers for the Thorn Development Partnership, Mr. Vance, she said, her voice crisp and professional. As you requested. Along with the foreclosure notices for all of Mr. Thorne's leveraged assets tied to Sterling Capital, and the complete file on Mr. Julian Vance's fraudulent representations and insider trading activities. The SEC will be very interested. She handed a separate, thinner folder directly to a bewildered Julian. Mr. Vance, this is a margin call from 3 different brokerage houses. It appears the market moved against your highly leveraged positions this afternoon. You are, I believe the term is wiped out. Julian stared at the folder in his hand, as if it were a venomous snake. The color drained from his face, and for a moment, It looked as if he might faint. The shark had been defanged, deboned, and served up on a platter. Richard finally collapsed. His legs gave out completely, and he slid to the floor behind the lectern, a pathetic, crumpled heap of expensive fabric and shattered pride. Eleanor rushed to his side, her face a mess of tears and confusion, finally shocked out of her passive enabling. The room erupted into a cacophony of panicked whispers. Bankers huddled together, speaking in urgent, low tones into their phones. The city's elite, who had come to celebrate a triumph, were now scrambling to distance themselves from a catastrophe. The party was over. Ethan stood amidst the wreckage, a figure of absolute calm. He looked at Clara, who was now openly sobbing, her beautiful dress a mockery of the festive occasion. She looked from her collapsed father to the ruined Julian, and then back to Ethan, the architect of it all. A new, desperate kind of hope flickered in her eyes. "Ethan," she whispered, taking a step toward the stage. "Ethan, we can fix this." I didn't know. I'm your wife. We can fix this." She was trying to reclaim her position, to appeal to a history he had just declared bankrupt. He saw her apology for what it was, not remorse for her betrayal, but terror at her own impending obsolescence. She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry she got caught on the losing side. He looked down at her from the stage, the physical distance between them a perfect metaphor for the emotional chasm that had opened. "There's no we anymore, Clara," he said, his voice flat and final. He picked up his old leather portfolio, the symbol of the hidden strength she had never bothered to see. "I came home at 3:17 p.m. last Thursday. The perfume in our bedroom wasn't yours." He let that final, personal betrayal hang in the air, a quiet, brutal confession for the entire room to hear. It was the keystone that locked the entire structure of his argument into place. It wasn't just business. It was personal, and it was over. He turned, walked past the weeping figure of his wife and the debris of her family's life, and descended the stage. Sarah fell into step beside him. They walked through the stunned, parting crowd, a sea of whispers and shocked faces following their progress. They didn't look back. As they reached the grand entrance of the club, Ethan paused and looked out into the cool, clear night. He took a deep breath. It was the first breath of a free man. The demolition was complete. Now it was time to build something new. The weeks that followed the cataclysm at the City Club were a study in consequences. The fallout from Ethan's revelations spread through the city's financial and social circles like a shockwave. The story became a modern fable, whispered about at every dinner party and board meeting. The tale of the quiet architect and the arrogant dynasty he had single-handedly dismantled was too dramatic, too perfect to remain a secret. Richard Thorne's fall was as swift as it was brutal. With Ethan's bank, Sterling Capital, foreclosing on his assets, and the Blackwood Tower project now indefinitely stalled under a cloud of legal and financial review, his empire crumbled to dust. The newspapers, which had once celebrated him as a titan of industry, now chronicled his ruin in exacting detail. He lost the faux Tuscan villa, the fleet of expensive cars, the club membership. He was forced to sell every trapping of the life he had built, piece by painful piece. But the financial loss was secondary to the loss of status. He had built his identity on the perception of power, and without it, he was nothing. He became a ghost, a recluse in a small, rented condominium, a man haunted by the memory of a night when his world had been unmade by the son-in-law he had so grievously underestimated. Julian Vance's fate was even more ignominious. The SEC, prompted by the meticulously detailed file Sarah had provided, launched a full-scale investigation. His house of cards, built on fraud and deception, collapsed under the slightest scrutiny. He was indicted on multiple counts of securities fraud and insider trading. His flashy car was repossessed, his assets frozen. The last Ethan heard, Julian had accepted a plea bargain and was facing a minimum of 5 years in a federal prison. The shark was now a very small fish in a very large, unforgiving pond. And Clara, her story was perhaps the most tragic in its own way. After the party, she had tried everything. There were frantic phone calls, tearful voicemails, long, rambling emails sent in the dead of night. They were a torrent of panic, regret, and desperate negotiation. She offered apologies, but they were always conditional, always tinged with a note of self-pity. "I'm sorry, but you have to understand the pressure I was under. I'm sorry, but my father raised me to value certain things. I'm sorry, but I never knew you were capable of such cruelty." Ethan never responded. His silence was his final judgment. He had filed for divorce the morning after the party. His lawyers, the best Ethelred Holdings could provide, handled all communication. Clara, stripped of her husband's wealth and her father's influence, found herself adrift. Her fair-weather friends, the ones who had flocked to her when she was at the center of the social universe, now avoided her calls. She was a pariah, a living reminder of a spectacular social implosion. She was forced to sell her designer clothes and handbags to pay for a small apartment in a less fashionable part of town. She had to get a job, for the first time in her life, working as a hostess in a restaurant where she had once been a prize customer. It was a poetic justice that was almost too perfect. She had finally learned the value of $1, but only after she had lost millions of them. Ethan, meanwhile, was building. He had moved out of the cold, minimalist house he had once shared with Clara and into a comfortable, light-filled penthouse apartment atop one of his own buildings. His life was simpler now, but also richer. The deception was gone. He no longer had to hide his success, to diminish himself to fit into someone else's narrow definition of who he should be. He met with Sarah in the soaring, sunlit atrium of a now-stalled Blackwood Tower. The construction site was quiet, a skeleton of steel and concrete reaching toward the sky. "What are we going to do with it?" Sarah asked, gesturing up at the massive structure. Ethan looked up, his architect's eyes seeing not the problems, but the possibilities. "We're going to redesign it," he said. The original design was a monument to arrogance. "We're going to turn it into something useful." Over the next few months, he did just that. He brought in his best teams. The 70-story monument to corporate greed was reimagined. The top floors were converted into luxury apartments, the sale of which would finance the rest of the project. The middle floors became state-of-the-art office spaces, designed to foster collaboration and creativity. But it was the bottom 20 floors that housed Ethan's true vision. He redesigned them as a mixed-use public space, a new home for the city's art museum, a state-of-the-art public library, a subsidized daycare for working families, and a significant portion of affordable housing units. The Blackwood Tower became the Vance Center, a symbol not of power, but of community. One day, months later, Ethan was walking through the bustling construction site of the Vance Center's public plaza. He was no longer in a suit, but in jeans, work boots, and a simple flannel shirt, a roll of blueprints under his arm. He was talking with the foreman when he saw a familiar figure lingering at the edge of the site. It was Eleanor, Clara's mother. She looked older, frielier. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a simple coat. She approached him tentatively, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I just wanted to see it. What you're building." Ethan nodded toward the rising structure. "It's coming along. It's beautiful," she said, and her voice was filled with a genuine wonder that had always been absent before. "Richard, he's not well. He just sits and stares at the walls. And Clara, she's working. She says it's hard, but she's different. Quieter." She looked at Ethan, her eyes filled with a sad, belated understanding. "I am sorry, Ethan, for all of it. I was a coward. I saw what they were doing, how they treated you, and I never said a word. I just wanted to keep the peace. Peace at any price is not peace, Eleanor," Ethan said gently. "It's just a delayed war. I know that now," she said, a single tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. "I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry." It was the first genuine apology he had received. It was not a plea for forgiveness, but a simple statement of fact. Ethan looked at the woman who had stood by and watched his slow humiliation, and he felt not anger, but a wave of profound pity. She was a victim of the same system of values that had corrupted her husband and daughter. "Thank you for telling me, Eleanor," he said. And he meant it. He couldn't give her absolution, but he could give her a moment of grace. He watched as she turned and walked away, a small, stooped figure disappearing into the city crowds. He felt a sense of closure, the final page turning on a long and painful chapter of his life. The Vance Center was completed 2 years later. The grand opening was not a lavish, exclusive party like the one at the City Club, but a public festival. The entire city was invited. There were food trucks, live music, and activities for children. Ethan stood on the observation deck of the tower, looking down at the thousands of people filling the plaza he had designed. Families were picnicking on the lawn, children were running through the fountains, and couples were strolling through the new museum. He had taken a symbol of division and exclusion and turned it into a place of gathering and connection. Sarah came to stand beside him. She handed him a glass of champagne. "To the Vance Center," she said, her voice filled with pride. "To new beginnings," Ethan replied, clinking his glass against hers. He looked out at the city skyline, a tapestry of buildings, each with a story. His story was now a part of that tapestry. He had learned that true strength wasn't about dominating others, but about having the integrity to build something that would last. He had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the positive impact you have on the world around you. He had faced betrayal and humiliation, but he had not allowed it to make him bitter or cruel. He had maintained his moral high ground, transforming his pain not into petty revenge, but into a catalyst for profound and positive change. He thought back to that Thursday afternoon, to the scent of a perfume that wasn't his wife's, the moment that had shattered his old life. He realized now that it hadn't been a moment of destruction, but a moment of liberation. It was the shock that had woken him up, that had forced him to stop diminishing himself and finally claim the power he had always possessed. He had lost a wife and a family that had never truly valued him, but he had gained himself. And in the end, that was a trade he would make 1,000 times over. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city he loved, the city he was helping to shape. He took a sip of his champagne, the bubbles fizzing on his tongue. The future stretched out before him, a clean, unwritten blueprint full of endless possibilities. And Ethan Vance, the architect, was ready to draw. So, what do we take away from Ethan's story? For me, it's a powerful reminder that our true worth is not determined by the opinions of others, especially those who are too blind to see our value. It's about the quiet dignity we maintain in the face of disrespect and the strength we build in silence. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt underestimated? How did you handle it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and your wisdom are what make this community so special. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found Ethan's story as satisfying and inspiring as I did, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more stories of justice, redemption, and the quiet triumph of the human spirit. We have many more stories to tell, and we'd be honored to share them with you. Until next time, remember to build your own foundation strong and never let anyone else define the limits of your ambition.